I am Stanley Robinson, a science fiction writer, mostly novels, and Californian, and member of the American science fiction community, I guess you'd say. I would define utopia as food, water, shelter, clothing, healthcare, and education for everybody on the planet, by whatever means gets us that. Or the work towards that state. So in other words, utopia, once you get a positive track of history where we are making big improvements on all those fronts, then you are in a utopian history, because it's not an end state, it's a dynamic process. It's hard to write about utopias because we're not used to them, and it is very easy to fall into a kind of trap of describing the system rather than having a plot unfold within the system. And really the novel is involved with characters and their interactions which make plots. The utopia, as defined by Sir Thomas More's first example, named Utopia, is more of a description of a system, a kind of walk through the zoo that can include detailed discussions of how sewage works or how money works, and this is not really what the novel does. So the utopian novel is a kind of a bastard form in that it is a mix of these two things that are not necessarily compatible, like soap operas and architectural blueprints. How those two are to be mixed into one genre is an ongoing problem in form and in novel writing. But that being said, there haven't been that many been done, and also utopia will always be under threat and dynamic. It will never be completely established. If it is, then you almost have a dystopia of permanence and of rigidity. So there are stories to be told about the creation of utopia, the maintenance of utopia, and the maybe restitution of it if it falls apart. So stories can be found and novelized in the utopian strand. And people have an interest, so it's a somewhat of an empty ecological niche in the cultural world, and so as you fill that niche, people have an interest. Yes, that's right, and you need danger, and you need that what you said, the negativity. But the thing about utopia, and what I've pursued as a working process in a couple of utopian novels, is that utopia does not mean immortality, nor does it mean perfection. So in utopia, people are still going to get sick and die, and in utopia you have the character A falls in love with character B, who falls in love with character C, who falls in love with character A, and these are painful, so that tragedy and pain still exist in utopia, and that's one point the utopian novel can make. Well, to a certain extent, the word utopia has been typed or defined by its examples, and the early utopists seem to be saying that this is a place outside history where we got everything right. So people were just deducing from the examples that they had. Then later, there's an attack on utopia from the status quo and from people like Marx and Engels who wanted to do things their way. So even though they were utopian thinkers, they didn't want, they wanted the other utopias to be discredited. So utopia has been attacked from all sides through its history. And one of these attacks are often political or ideological. People don't like the idea of the order changing for the better because they would like to defend the status quo because they're privileged within it. So the anti-utopian attack is often very self-interested to a specific ideology. Well, I think plausible utopian fictions that are essentially do the science fictional thing of building a future history. So you have a science fiction novel that's placed at a certain distance off into the future from now, say 50 years, 100 years, 500 years, different spans of time are used. And then the book or the story, the movie, implies the history that got from now till that point. And so that is the operative function of science fiction. It's a historical literature in that respect. And you build a future history. So when you build positive future histories, young people especially respond well to these because they would like to have hope that what they do can lead to a better future or have meaning in the present because it's leading to a better future. So I think that telling utopian stories, writing utopian fiction, is a help to people. I like Buddhism. Buddhism is one of the great world religions. It's extremely old, and it strikes me that it has, in many of its aspects, a fairly realistic, positive, and helpful reaction to reality itself. It's not really, at least in its core beliefs, it's not very much transcendental. It's not so much a religion as it is a way of behaving, and I like those things about it. And I have my characters say all kinds of things in the context of my books. But I think that science and Buddhism are similar in that they both started out of a sense of compassion and a sense of reducing human suffering. What can we do to reduce human suffering? And Buddhism had very little to work with in its beginnings at 600 BC, except for attitude, because the attitude that you take towards things is a crucial determinant in how they feel to you. So working at the level of feelings. And then science began to work on the level of the physical manifestations of illness and the like. It began as medicine. So the two of them have that similarity, and they've rarely strayed from that central goal that they have, which is impressive about both of them. At the end of World War II, civilization had to reconstruct itself, and the rules by which they reconstructed the world were, in many cases, drawn out of H.G. Wells's utopian novels. Similarly, the progressive movement in American politics is the first decade or decade and a half of the 20th century is a result of Bellamy's utopian novel Looking Backwards from the year 2000. So those are two good examples. In general, I think what happens is that we want life to mean something. And when we get our explanations, we get them through stories of one kind or another. They could be religious stories, they could be scientific stories, they could be stories that come out of art. But we explain the world by way of stories, and then we create a sense of meaning, which is crucially important for human function, out of stories. So the stories are important.